Hello and welcome to the Cheeky Science Show, where in this video I'm going to talk about the recent book that I just read, Future Foods: How Modern Science is Transforming the Way We Eat, by David McClements. So as with my usual book summary videos, I'll try and cover what I learnt from the book in this video and summarize it in a manner that is much shorter than the time it took me to read the book, and that's not a bad thing, I'm just quite a slow reader. But anyway, the title of this book pretty much summarizes what the book really is about, how modern science is transforming the way we eat. And that basically means that if we can understand the current foods, how they're put together, how they're digested, how they're processed within our bodies, and understand why we like certain foods, what certain foods are best for us to be eating, what's best for the planet, what's most sustainable, we can use that knowledge to help design the future foods that we may be consuming. So who is David McClements? Well, he's originally from the north of England, but has lived in California, Ireland, France, and currently he's now in Massachusetts, where he's a distinguished professor at the Department of Food Science at the University of Massachusetts and specializes in the area of food design and nanotechnology. And using this knowledge, this book covers a variety of different topics that initially stem from two original questions that David had. Firstly, what should I and my family eat? And secondly, how will we feed the growing world population? And so as you'll come to learn, both of the answers to these questions are extremely complex. But as David highlights near the start of the book, the richness and diversity of the science underpinning the design, creation, and consumption of foods are unappreciated by most people, including the majority of scientists. And the point is that it's important to actually try and understand the science behind these different technologies to participate in the debate about the proper implementation, because they are going to affect our future and the future of subsequent generations. So I've used these two major questions to try and break down this video. And so initially we'll talk about what should I and my family eat, and the idea that it's not just necessarily about health, but also about when and how to eat, and basically the whole thing's very complex. And then the second question, how will we feed the growing world population, comes down to the fact that the global population could reach more than 9 billion people by 2050. And to be able to feed the world, priorities need to be made in terms of meeting people's basic needs, ensuring what people eat is safe, but also maintaining a sustainable environment. And this is quite a challenge that we have on our hands at the moment. But there are technologies, as we'll see in this video, that could help us achieve this goal in a sustainable manner. Although a huge amount of this food could come from reducing the huge amount of waste that is currently produced from food, estimates suggest that a third of all food produced globally for human consumption is lost or wasted, equating to around 1.3 billion tonnes per year. So to address both of these questions, you need food scientists. And these scientists can have backgrounds in a variety of different disciplines, from chemistry, physics, biology, engineering, nutrition, psychology, and social sciences. And their aim is to create safer, healthier, tastier, cheaper, more innovative, and more sustainable foods. And so it may be surprising as to how many different disciplines are involved. And I recently spoke about in a previous video about gastrophysics, which basically looks at how context in which food is consumed has an enormous impact on its perceived quality. So amongst many other things, food scientists are trying to build better foods. And to be able to build better foods, you need to understand firstly how foods are actually built, which involves understanding the critical role that proteins play in determining the look, feel, and flavour of conventional foods, and to identify potential plant-based alternatives with similar properties, or other more sustainable options. So a key factor in terms of what foods people like to eat is the taste of a food, and so we have 5 basic tastes: sweetness, saltiness, sourness, bitterness, and savoury. However, what you might not know is that as much as 85% of the overall flavour of a food actually comes down to the food's aroma, not just its taste. And so the aroma of a food is the result of the mist of volatile molecules that arise from the surface of the food and are detected by receptors in our nasal cavity. And the really interesting thing is that aroma is not just from the flavour molecules that we breathe in through our nose, called the orthonasal route. You also get detection when food is already in our mouth and vapours travel up through the back of our throats and to the top of the nasal cavity, called retronasal olfaction. And foods smell differently depending on whether the volatile molecules released from them enter either ortho or retronasally. And the reason that happens is because the aroma receptors are organised differently in our nasal cavities from back to front, and so it activates a different pattern of receptors. So I thought that was pretty cool. But another thing that was really interesting is that the aroma of a food also depends on the food matrix. And so you could have two foods that contain exactly the same flavours but smell and taste very differently because of the food matrix. So what does the food matrix really mean? Well, basically it means the precise molecular environment of a flavour affects how it is released from a food and then perceived. An example used in the book by David is the aroma of garlic in salad dressing. And so garlic is hydrophobic, and so that means it prefers to reside in fatty regions. So if you have a full fat dressing, garlic mainly is dissolved in the oil, and so few molecules of the garlic aroma are released. Whereas in low fat salad dressing, the garlic aroma molecules are more likely to rise into the air, and so the aroma is much stronger. And so the interesting thing to take from this is the fact that the difference between low fat alternatives to high fat foods may have impacts on the aroma of a food and therefore its desirability to be eaten. And so the flavour release profile, how intense the flavour changes during eating, can be manipulated by altering the food matrix. However, the food matrix can also alter how fast the food is digested. The reason why eating a diet rich in whole foods such as nuts, beans, grains and fruits and vegetables makes us feel full is because the fat, proteins and carbohydrates are trapped in complex plant tissues that are more resistant to digestive enzymes and so are released more slowly. And slowing down the release of nutrients such as glucose, cholesterol and fat into the bloodstream is now being investigated by food scientists to prevent ailments such as diabetes and heart disease. And it can also be used to try and design foods to increase the fraction of beneficial nutrients to be released, such as vitamins, minerals, and nutraceuticals, so that more of them can be absorbed by the body, rather than just passing through. So the key takeaway is that simply by changing the structure of a food, it can have a profound impact on our eating behaviour, body weight, and health. And that's because it's not necessarily just about the food structure, but also about how we eat it as well. David mentions the researcher Kieran Ford at Singapore Institute for Clinical Science, where his studies show that people who eat faster tended to eat more. However, this doesn't necessarily correlate with the number of calories absorbed by the body because, for example, studies have shown with nuts that short chewers tend to eat more of the nuts, but you get an increase in the undigested nuts in feces, so there's less calories being extracted. So these topics seem to deviate from the initial question of what should we actually be eating then? And so what should we actually be eating then? So David refers to what he considers the best diet study, where they try to investigate the association between carbohydrate intake and mortality. And what they conclude is that the suggested energy intake from carbs should make up around 50 to 55% of your calorie intake. However, the risk associated with mortality seems to depend more on whether the protein comes from plant-based proteins or whether it comes from animal-based ones. And so while the overall message seems to be what you've probably already heard before, which is to eat things in moderation and to favour plant-based foods where possible. But is this really the best that we could do in the future? Well, maybe if we're going to generalise, but in the future we might see more of the already hyped personalised nutrition. And so personalised nutrition is just that. What we should eat depends on ourselves. It depends not only on our genetics or our microbiome, but also on our lifestyle and energy requirements and also our age. So, personalised nutrition aims to create individualised dietary recommendations that would hopefully improve health and performance. And so, whilst this maybe sounds trivial, it is far from that and is very complex in terms of how it could actually work. For example, to ever do this accurately, whatever algorithms being used for this personalised nutrition would require your DNA, a whole range of different biomarkers that could be easily taken from your blood and would also probably be needed to be assessed on a frequent time basis, if not continuously, to have a good understanding of the impact of the food you've consumed on your health and performance. And it would also need to assess your lifestyle, your goals, and a lot of this information is information you may not want to be providing to different corporations or governments, rightly so. But the author does rightly remark that we do already give up a lot of this information every time we use the internet, I guess depending on what browser you use, such as what we buy, what we read, where we travel, and our activity levels. And another piece of information they might also want is your microbiome composition. And so there actually already is a company that exists that I've spoken about before in this channel called Phiome. And what Phiome claims to be able to do is to take information from your microbiome and to give you a personalized nutrition. However, like all of these different companies at the moment, the different algorithms or machine learning techniques that they use to make these nutrition profiles initially needs to be trained on data. And so over time, over increased amounts of data, the assessments and outputs of these different algorithms will improve. And so I guess it just depends. Well, it just needs information, lots and lots and lots and lots of information. And as I said as well, the idea about potentially needing continuous measurements, doing blood samples or microbiome assessments isn't really feasible on a daily schedule. So what you'd really need is personal biometric sensors. And I guess the ultimate goal would be to measure biomarkers without having to collect and analyze biological samples, such as wearable devices. And it may not be too far into the future until we see such devices, because some of them already exist. For example, there are now wearable devices that can measure blood glucose levels continuously and painlessly, which has been especially useful for diabetic patients. And so the author's take is that there's enormous potential for personalised nutrition if improvements in state-of-the-art computational approaches to collect the biometric data can be achieved, as well as the systems biology to bring together the knowledge from different sources and to create a more detailed picture of their relationship between diet and health in individuals. And so if we go back now to one of the two questions that I introduced at the beginning, what should I and my family eat? I think it's pretty clear that the answer to this question is very complicated and will be specific to individuals. So in the second half of the book, David addresses the second question, how will we feed the growing world population? And the best way I thought to kind of go through this section is to break it down into three parts. The first looking at food biotechnology, then we'll look at food nanotechnology, and lastly, we'll talk about replacements of traditional animal products with more sustainable and ethical alternatives. So starting with food biotechnology, David makes it very clear that he understands that people have differing opinions over the use of food biotechnology, such as genetically modified crops. And he raises the point that we need to just be able to listen to each other and to understand the science. And the book just tries to address the science that goes behind all of these different applications. That said, the risks and benefits of these different technologies should always be assessed. So beginning with genetically modified crops, the common examples are genetic modification such that you can enhance the growth of the crops and improve its resistance to different diseases. And so the idea being that the crop yield is greater, and so this could help create more food for the growing population. But genetic modification can also be used for biofortification. For example, genes of stable crops can be altered so plants naturally retain more iron, and iron deficiency is currently the most common form of micronutrient deficiency in the world. So these applications have health considerations as well as sustainability applications. and it can also be used to eliminate harmful substances. For example, it has been used to create a new type of wheat with much lower levels of gluten. Gluten can cause an autoimmune response in some people, resulting in the condition celiac disease. So by improving yields, resilience, and versatility, food biotechnology has continuous potential for the future. However, David does reiterate that it is impossible to say that all genetically engineered foods are completely safe, but it is also wrong to say that just because a food has been genetically modified, that it is unsafe. And highly respected scientific organizations actually strongly support the use of genetic engineering in foods and agriculture, based on the vast body of literature, including the World Health Organization. So I knew quite a bit about food biotechnology before reading this book, but what I didn't know so much about was food nanotechnology, which is what David specializes in. So this phrase may sound a bit scary, but nanotechnology refers to creating and utilizing structures with minuscule dimensions. So it's just working with things that are very small. And the benefits of doing this is that very small structures have unique properties, such as one, their small size, obviously, but second, by having such a small size, they have a much larger surface area to volume ratio, and that can be exploited. And lastly, they have high reactivity due to the fact that the properties of matter inside particles change when they become very small due to quantum effects. But don't worry, we won't go into that because I don't really understand it. So how will food nanotechnology help with solving the solution for increased food demand? Well, David gives a couple of examples in the book, such as feeding plants with nanofertilizers and protecting crops with nanopesticides. But the coolest example, in my opinion, are sensors made from carbon nanotubes that can be absorbed by plants and can actually send signals to a smartphone when a crop becomes contaminated with pesticides. And so this comes from research in a Nature paper that came out in 2016, which you can see here. And it goes into more detail about how the system would actually work. But the idea is that only a couple of the plants would need to have this sensor, and they could be indicators for the whole crop. And so it wouldn't necessarily be that you're consuming these carbon nanotubes along with your salads. I don't know. Anyway, David highlights that there are three main hurdles before we could see nanotechnology becoming widespread in foods. Firstly, food nanotechnology would need to become economically viable and become more cost-effective than competing technologies. Secondly, there would have to be no health or environmental risks with using these different nanotechnologies, such as these nanofertilizers. And then lastly, and probably the most important, it would have to be accepted by the public. And so lastly, we'll look at how traditional animal products can be replaced with more sustainable and ethical alternatives. And so the reason that doing this achieves the second question of how will we feed the growing world population comes from the quite alarming statistics that whilst meat consumption only makes up around 15% of the energy requirements of the global population, it uses around 80% of the available agricultural land for either grazing or producing fodder. However, it should be stated that the environmental impact does differ depending on the kind of meat, with beef being more damaging to the environment than pork, poultry, or fish production. However, it should be stated first that the meat industry has become efficient in using every part of the animal, including the skin, bones, and hooves, to create other products, such as converting it to gelatin, which is used in the creation of yogurts, for example. Also, David also mentions that in the future there will definitely still be a place for animals, partly because animals can live on land that isn't suitable for arable production, and they can also convert grass, leaves, husks, shells into high-quality sources of protein, vitamins, and minerals. So what alternatives are there? Well, it's very likely that you've either seen in shops, and potentially even tried yourself, plant-based alternatives. David addresses plant-based alternatives by looking at plant-based burgers. For example, you have plant-based burgers produced by Impossible Foods and also Beyond Meat. But to get anywhere close to actually mimicking the meat burgers, you need to understand the physics and chemistry of meat structure, including that of the muscle fibers, the connective tissue, and the adipose tissue in whole meat. and also how those different structures and components change during the cooking process. And one example is the fact that meat goes from this reddish colour when it's uncooked to brown when it is cooked. And that's due to the oxygen being strongly bound to a protein known as myoglobin. And when that temperature change occurs during cooking, there's a structural transformation of this protein myoglobin such that oxygen is released, and there's an iron cofactor in this molecule as well that loses an electron and actually transitions the colour from red to brown. So how could that be mimicked using plant-based alternatives? Well, Impossible Foods identified a plant-based alternative to myoglobin, leg hemoglobin, and it comes from the root nodules of soybeans. And so this can give the plant burger a red meat-like appearance and also the meaty flavour. So there's definitely a lot of research going into plant-based alternatives at the moment, but this isn't the only solution. Another way that you can actually consume meat in a more ethical manner comes from cultured meat. And so that's where beef, pork, chicken or fish can be grown in a lab or a factory from living cells taken from animals without having to kill them. The way this is done can be described through 3 steps. First of all, you have the collection stage, and so this is where cells are taken from the living animal. And so these cells can be stored and used later on, and it's been estimated that only 150 cows could in theory produce all the beef the world currently needs. Once you have these cells, the second stage is the proliferation stage, which kind of given by its name is when the cells grow and they replicate. And then lastly, you have the maturation stage. So here, the conditions of the environment in which the cells are growing is altered. So you get the desired cell type. For example, if you're wanting to make beef, you'd want them to be generating muscle, adipose, and connective tissue cells. So as a scientist who has much experience with growing cells in a lab, I honestly think this is really ingenious and really awesome. And so if you're also interested, you should check out a video on one company that is developing cultured meat. I believe it's just pronounced Just. And you can watch a video of them generate chicken nuggets from a chicken that they called Ian. And they eat these chicken nuggets whilst Ian is like just walking about besides them. So that's kind of cute. But the interesting application of this is that you can grow meat from just like 1 or 2 cells from a live animal. So what if we took one of our own cells? Yeah, it's a little bit grim. Kind of freaked me out when I read it too. I mean, I definitely would only ever consider eating meat from my own cells. I don't know. But the point is that it's possible. And continuing with neophobia, fear of new foods, and disgust, another possible future foods, or well, it's already considered a food, just not so much in Western culture, is the consumption of insects, or entomophagy, to be precise. So the ethical benefits of eating insects is the fact that most edible insects don't have a central nervous system, so don't feel pain. And in terms of the sustainability, insects are more efficient at converting feed into food and leads to fewer greenhouse gases than animals, and they can eat waste such as wasted food crops to grow, and there's also the potential to eat insects that would otherwise be pests for other plants. But if eating bugs still creeps you out, then there's also the potential for the insect to be dried and ground into flowers. However, what might concern you is that we're already entomophagists. The FDA apparently allows a certain number of insect parts in certain food products. For example, 20 maggots per 100 grams of mushrooms, 35 fruit fly eggs per 230 grams of golden raisins, and 475 insect fragments per 50 grams of ground pepper. Yum. Anyway, along with these other technologies, eating insects, the safety considerations will also need to be taken into account. For example, they may have toxins, it may change our microbiome. However, so far, the European Food Safety Authority have reviewed evidence and said that there's no more risk consuming insects over other forms of food, as long as they're handled and processed correctly to ensure their safety. So maybe we'll be seeing insects a lot more in the future. And so the last alternative that David mentions are microbial meat. And you most likely have heard about this For example, from corn, the mycoprotein produced by the fungus Fusarium venenatum, and along with insects and plant-based alternatives, the advantages to using microbial species is that they reduce food waste, they obviously use much less land and produce much less pollution. And an exciting advance mentioned by David is from a Finnish company referred to as Solar Foods, and they claim to make food out of thin air. Effectively, they're coaxing autotrophic bacteria into producing a nutrient-rich edible protein using only air and sunlight and a few minerals. According to their presentation, their novel protein, soline, requires 10 times less land than conventional agriculture, 100 times less greenhouse gases are produced than meat, and it doesn't cause pollution because it uses a closed system. The challenges they face will be scaling up and using their product and integrating it into different food products that people will actually want to eat. But a really cool use of this technology would be if we ever go to Mars, or the first astronauts to go to Mars, in terms of being able to generate a good food source. Bacteria that can generate a protein from minimal inputs would be really desirable. So to put all of this information together, David concludes that he's personally convinced that science and technology must play a critical role in ensuring a healthier and more sustainable food supply. And the best take-home message, quoting word for word, "The future of our food supply is too important for us to make decisions based on irrational beliefs rather than sound evidence. And the point is, we need to become more informed, to listen, engage with others who have differing opinions, and to advocate for the future we believe in through our actions, purchases, and votes." So hopefully this video has given you a good, very brief, probably not that in-depth overview to this book, but I hope it gives you some insights into what we could see in the future and how important science is to these different applications. And generally, I think, the book was really interesting and got me excited and fascinated at the same time, which is always a good thing. So go check out the book. There's a lot of things I didn't get to mention. So yeah. So I hope you've learned something. And as always, thanks for listening.